The ambush at Poteau is one of the most iconic scenes of the Battle of the Bulge. The men of the 14th Cavalry Group were ambushed by members of the 1st SS Panzer Division, resulting in the iconic photographs and footage many of us know. However, the Cavalry Group had come a long way to end up at Poteau. In this video we will follow the 14th Cavalry Group in the opening 3 days of the German offensive in the Ardennes. The 14th Cavalry Group had taken over their positions in the Ardennes on the 11th of December 1944, only a handful of days before the German offensive. The group was attached to the 106th Infantry Division and was tasked with defending a part of the Losheim Gap. The cavalrymen were positioned between the 106th Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division, the former to the south, the latter to the north. They held a line through the German-Belgian border around the villages of Roer, Grewinkel and Bertharath. It was a textbook example of the Ardennes plateau terrain, quite open, dotted with streams, copses and villages. It was around the latter that the cavalry group's defences were located. The precariousness of the line held by the 14th Cavalry Group just before the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive can be shown by the fact that the gaps existed on either flank of the cavalry group. The one between them and the 99th Division was just short of 3 kilometers wide and was patrolled at 2-hour intervals by either A Company 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion attached to the cavalry or by members of the 99th Checkerboard Division. The gap between the cavalrymen and the men of the 106th Infantry Division's 422nd Infantry Regiment was slightly smaller, being 2.5 kilometers wide. The 14th Cavalry Group under the command of Colonel Devine mainly consisted of 2 squadrons, the 18th, which had been in the area from October 1944, and the 32nd. The 32nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron was in the area of Vierzalm for refitting, but was available to Colonel Devine at very short notice. The command post was set up just behind the front line at Manderfeld. The cavalry group wasn't trained for these defensive missions, let alone operate practically alone, due to the kilometer-wide gaps on either flanks. Now is perhaps a good time to look at how a squadron was formed. The squadron consisted of a headquarters followed by 3 troops, A, B and C. These were equipped with the famous M8 light armoured cars, more colloquially known as Greyhound, especially in British service, and jeeps. A squadron was further strengthened by an assault gun troop, Troop E. These troops were equipped with the M8 howitzer motor carriages. This assault gun was formed from the M5 Stuart light tank's hull and had a 75mm howitzer gun. Next to a service company there was also the Light Tank Company, Company F, equipped with the M5 Stuart light tank. The Germans found out about the precarious state of the American lines just a few days before they launched their offensive. They became aware of the gaps and decided to exploit the one between the cavalry group and the 106th Infantry Division. While the Germans were preparing for their assault, Devine and his staff prepared a defensive plan, including possible withdrawal routes. This plan seems to have finished on the 15th of December 1944, but was never circulated to the men. Directly opposite the cavalry group was the boundary of the German 5th and 6th Panzer Armies. Members of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, reinforced by tanks and a part of the 6th Panzer Army, were opposite the northern flank. The German paratroopers would face 2 platoons of the 18th Cavalry Squadron C Troop, 2 reconnaissance platoons and a company of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. To the south were the men of the Grenadier Regiments 294 and 295 of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division. Here the German 5th Panzer Army also deployed several dozen assault guns. They would face 1 platoon of C Troop and A Troop of the 18th Cavalry Squadron. The headquarters of the 18th Cavalry Squadron and 14th Cavalry Group was at Manderfeld, thus being on the northern flank. At about 4 AM on December 16, 1944, the first German companies began their attack on the dispersed line of the 14th Cavalry Group. An hour later both Grenadier regiments joined the attack. The 294th Grenadier Regiment attacked towards Wegrath, while the 295th was attacking towards Roth and Kopscheid. Visibility was so poor that some companies moved between the American defences undetected. However, where the Germans did come into contact with the cavalrymen, they were quickly pushed back. By dawn, German artillery had also joined the fray. A German attack on Kopscheid resulted in almost 40 German prisoners. While the small garrisons had managed to withstand most of the initial attack, the magnitude of the German penetrations only became apparent to the 14th Cavalry Group as it was getting light. Just after 8:30 am, several assault guns were harassing the Roth defences and the German infantry was starting to pour into the small hamlet. Several light tanks were promptly released from Manderfeld, but by that time the Germans had already taken over, and there they managed to prevent the American light tanks from advancing. Radio contact with Roth had fallen. A troop at Kopscheid was also still holding the hamlet, albeit by the skin of their teeth. The 3rd platoon of C Troop had dug in near a small copse on the eastern side of Weckerath. With Alv having fallen in German hands only hours before, they were quickly subjected to attacks by the Grenadier Regiment 294 as well. 3rd platoon C Troop was well dug in and they managed to repel the first German attack. 2 German companies flanked the copse and began to pour into Weckerath itself. However, some 20 men of the headquarters section of C Troop held them at bay. By 9:30 am, a platoon of light tanks arrived from Manderfeld and broke up the German assault. By 11 am, Weckerath was still holding out. It proved to be an excellent point of observation. As the morning mist had faded, the Weckerath defenders spotted several dozen assault guns supported by infantry moving between Roth and Auv. The northern flank of the 14th Cavalry Group wasn't spared from the fighting either. Krewinkel was held by the 2nd Platoon of Troop C and a reconnaissance platoon of A Company 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Just before dawn, the Germans tried to take the hamlet in a swift action. However, the cavalrymen and tank destroyer personnel pushed the Germans back after a firefight in the town centre. Just after dawn and just after an artillery barrage, the Germans tried again to dislodge the cavalrymen from Krewinkel. The attack was once again fruitless and by noon the Americans were still in control of the village. In Avst, where the 1st platoon of C Troop was dug in, the cavalrymen were met by similar attacks. Just like at the neighbouring Krewinkel, Avst remained in American hands after 2 German attacks had been pushed back with only minor losses to the defenders. The extreme left flank of the cavalry group consisted of A Company reinforced by 2 reconnaissance platoons, all from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. They held the villages of Berterath, Merlscheid and Lanzerath. Unlike the cavalrymen to the south, the men of the Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with the towed 3-inch anti-tank guns, were quickly overrun. Only 3 guns managed to get back to Manderfeld, where they took up better positions. The rest, apart from 1, were put out of action by the crew. Just after 6 am, the 32nd Cavalry Squadron was put on the alert. Some vehicles were partly disassembled, but that did not prevent the squadron from moving out at 9:30 am. Colonel Devine had quickly realised that the 18th Cavalry Squadron alone wasn't going to hold out for long. His islands of resistance were faltering or on the verge of being surrounded. He therefore came up with the plan of setting up a new defensive line around the Manderfeld Ridge behind the initial front line. Shortly after 11 am, the 32nd Squadron arrived on the scene of battle. E Troop quickly moved its assault guns to predetermined positions in and around Manderfeld, while C Troop took up positions to the northwest of the town along the road to Lanzerath. 2 dismounted platoons of Troop A meanwhile dug in to the southwest of the village. The rest of Troop A was sent to Holzheim further to the northwest to cover the 14th Cavalry Group's left and rear flank. Troop B was sent further back to the village of Antler, where they needed to stop the German forces coming from Auv. The bridge over the Our River was a vital objective which needed to be held by the men of B Troop. With the 32nd Cavalry Squadron in position on the Manderfeld Ridge, it was time for the 18th Cavalry Squadron to withdraw. Colonel Devine dispatched the order to withdraw shortly after midday, but Troop C was the only troop to respond. The 3rd Platoon to the east of Weckerath counted 2 armoured cars and a handful of jeeps. All guns blazing, they withdrew from their positions and headed into Weckerath itself, where they were joined by the platoon of light tanks and the headquarters group. Just as they withdrew westwards, the Germans bombarded the handful of buildings, heralding another assault on the village. The cavalrymen had escaped in the brink of time. At 12:40 p.m, both the Krewinkel and Avst garrisons withdrew without incidents. By the time the men of C Troop 18th Cavalry Squadron arrived at Manderfeld, those already in position were already exchanging fire with the Germans to the south and southwest. The 75mm howitzers proved to be quite effective in pouring fire into the German flanks. As has been mentioned earlier on, radio contact with Roth had fallen in the morning. The Roth garrison fought on, but was compelled to surrender sometime during the afternoon. The Kopscheid defenders held on until 4:30 p.m, when 1st Lieutenant Lorenz Herdrich led 60 men out of the encirclement. Herdrich's group would reach the Vith defenders safe and sound on the 19th of December, nearly 4 days later. At Manderfeld it quickly became clear that the new positions were untenable. German troops were reported to be streaming westwards through the large gaps in the American defensive line. Contact with the 99th Infantry Division to the north had already been lost for quite a while, and the 106th Infantry Division, to which the Cavalry Group had been attached, had also made it clear that it was in no position of averting the pressure from the hardly pressed cavalrymen. Colonel Devine promptly set up a small task force under Major Mays to retake the ground near Lanzerath to the north. Task Force Mays consisted of C Troop and the assault gun troop of the 18th Cavalry Squadron. Less than a kilometre and a half, however, the column was already entangled in heavy fighting. The Germans were firing on the cavalrymen from three sides with infantry and armour. Although the American assault guns put up a valiant effort, Task Force May's attack was checked. To the south of Manderfeld the situation wasn't any better. The Germans had captured Vischheid and were heading towards the Our Bridge at Antler. The salient at Manderfeld was starting to turn into a pocket. By 4 p.m. it was clear that also Manderfeld had to be given up. The headquarters of the 106th Infantry Division authorized a withdrawal to new defences. A line stretching north to south between Holzheim and Antler was chosen for this occasion. Task Force Mays was ordered to cover the withdrawal. All went well, and by 5 p.m. the last US troops had left the village. At dusk, Troops E and C of the 18th Cavalry Squadron joined up with A Troop of the 32nd Cavalry Squadron already in Holzheim to form the northern flank of the Cavalry Group. B Troop of the 32nd, which was still at Antler, was to guard the southern flank of the group. The light tank company of the 32nd Squadron was placed to the southwest at Hoyem to cover the Schönberg-Saar-Vith road. The rest of the 32nd Squadron was put at Heresbach, just behind the new line. The remainder of the 18th Squadron was also placed just behind the main line. They were put near the village of Vith. However, this last reshuffle of putting the 18th Squadron at Vith resulted in E and C Squadrons abandoning their fellow comrades of the 32nd Cavalry Squadron's A Troop at Holzheim, thus leaving A Troop all alone in the defence of the Cavalry Group's northern flank. A Troop was worried about its left flank being in the air, and the troop commander subsequently asked permission to withdraw to Honsfeld, a village a few kilometers to the north under the 99th Infantry Division's jurisdiction. Upon a request for a liaison officer's report, A Troop took the initiative and headed for Honsfeld, regardless of what headquarters might have thought. The troop reached Honsfeld later that evening at 9 p.m. Honsfeld was captured by the Germans before dawn on the 17th of December 1944. With Holzheim left abandoned, the 14th Cavalry Group's line ran from Vith to Heresbach and thence on to Antler. That 16th of December 1944, the Germans were able to exploit the gaping holes in the American defences to their advantage. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division had captured Alv, overrunning several US artillery positions in the rear. The fact that the defences had such big gaps in them resulted in the American units having to fight on its own. The 14th Cavalry Group was unable to provide flank support to the 106th Infantry Division and vice versa. Overall cohesion had been lost, forcing the units to fight with whatever means they had at their disposal. The 294th Grenadier Regiment was meanwhile being reinforced with an armoured battalion ready to push towards Antler the following day. To the north, elements of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and the 1st SS Leibstandarte Panzer Division were pushing through the gap between the Cavalry Group and the 99th Infantry Division. Colonel Devine meanwhile had moved back to Saar-Vith to discuss the proceedings with General Jones in command of the 106th Infantry Division. Jones, however, was too busy with the plans for the 7th Armoured Division to counterattack, so the meeting with Devine had to wait. At daybreak on the 17th of December 1944, the Germans launched their attack on Antler. Supported by tanks, the infantry quickly gained the upper hand, forcing Captain Lindsay Jr.'s B Troop 32nd Cavalry Squadron to withdraw to Schönberg. This move left Heresbach isolated. Upon approval of Colonel Devine, who had in the meantime arrived at his new command post at Meyerode, Troops E and C and the headquarters, all of the 32nd Cavalry Squadron, began to withdraw from Heresbach. Meanwhile at Schönberg, elements of the 294th Grenadier Regiment attacked B Troop of the 32nd Cavalry Squadron. The Americans in their M8 Greyhounds were once again forced to withdraw. With the capture of Schönberg, the German 18th Volksgrenadier Division was able to close the Bleialf auf Schönberg pocket. Large part of the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments of the 106th Infantry Division had become surrounded in the Schnee-Eifel. Finally, Captain Lindsay Jr.'s B Troop arrived at favourable defensive positions. the troop hastily set up a new line at Hoyam with its 6 M8 armoured cars and various machine guns and jeeps. The leading German panzer or assault gun was forced to withdraw under the quick-firing 37mm rounds. The following infantry attacks were all repelled by accurate machine gun and mortar fire. The 294th Grenadier Regiment was stopped in its tracks by B Troop for nearly 2 hours. At about 10:50 am, the troop was ordered back to Vith to join the 32nd Squadron to the northeast of the city. While B Troop was gallantly fighting off the German attacks, Colonel Devine had ordered his cavalry group back to Vith after multiple reports came in of German troops heading westwards in the vicinity of Vith. By noon, the 32nd Squadron had deployed at Wallerode, while the 18th had deployed at Bonn, slightly to the northwest. The 14th Cavalry Group had arrived to what Colonel Devine called the final delaying position. An overlay was promptly sent to the 106th Infantry Division with the Cavalry Group's new dispositions. The 14th Cavalry Group was now in a perfect position to screen the pending arrival of the 7th Armoured Division at Vith. However, later that afternoon the group was withdrawn again, this time to Recht and the positions along the Recht stream to the south of the town. This last withdrawal didn't go as smoothly as hoped. Both squadrons withdrew using the same road, causing the group to get entangled in a hefty traffic jam just as darkness was starting to fall. At the end of the day, the disorganized cavalry group could be found between Recht and Poteau. The situation was made worse by the arrival of Combat Command R of the 7th Armoured Division in that same area. Shortly after darkness had settled in, Colonel Devine set off with most of his staff to reconnoitre the ground. However, near Recht the column was ambushed. Devine and 2 other officers managed to escape on foot. This certainly didn't help the already chaotic state of the cavalry group. The group's executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Duggan, arrived back at the command post at 2:30 am the following day. Colonel Devine, slightly wounded, arrived 5 hours after the ambush and was exhausted. He urged Duggan to take over. Colonel Devine would be evacuated from the front line. By the end of the 17th of December 1944, the defences around Vith were starting to form. The 7th Armoured Division had arrived on the scene and a perimeter around the city was created. The 14th Cavalry Group was located to the northwest, but they were in a poor state. They had been in combat from the morning of the 16th of December onwards, losing several troops in the process. The Cavalry Group was in a difficult state to continue the fight the next day, December 18. Around midnight, the 14th Cavalry Group's headquarters, which had been set up at Poteau, received a message that they were to recapture the high ground at Bonn, which they had abandoned on the afternoon of the previous day. Early on the 18th of December 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Augustine Duggan, the senior of the remaining Cavalry Group staff, halted a column of the group. The column consisted of various elements of the 18th Squadron, a part of the 32nd Squadron C Troop, and the one remaining platoon of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Once again, Major Mays was put in command of an ad hoc task force. This time, Mays was ordered back to Bonn. Just after dark, the column left the Poteau crossroads in the direction of Recht. They didn't get far, however, before they were ambushed by elements of Kampfgruppe Hansen of the 1st SS Panzer Division. An M5 Stuart light tank was quickly knocked out, as well as an M8 armoured car and several other vehicles. Mays' task force quickly pulled back to Poteau, leaving behind several vehicles on the road. The 14th Cavalry Group held out until midday, when Poteau also had to be abandoned. No longer being in contact with friendly forces, Lieutenant Colonel Duggan ordered his group to fall back to Vieilles-Alpes via Petitier. 3 M8 armoured cars, 2 jeeps and an M5 Stuart were all that was left of the column. They carried wounded with them, while many other cavalrymen were forced to withdraw on foot. The unit was withdrawn from combat duties later that day and brought to the rear. And so ended the first 3 days of the 14th Cavalry Group's Battle of the Bulge. They had fought gallantly but had suffered terrible losses in return. 28% of its personnel was lost, along with 35% of its equipment. The group was forced to act outside its normal activities, and by the end of the 18th of December, all that was left was a composite squadron. In spite of the German superiority in both numbers and equipment, the 14th Cavalry Group was able to function as a coherent fighting force until the evening of the 17th of December. At some stages, certainly during the initial day of the German offensive, the cavalry group was even able to beat off several attacks and thus remained a force to be reckoned with. This was the Ace Destroyer. I hope you enjoyed this video about the 14th Cavalry Group's actions during the Ardennes offensive. If you would like to see more Battle of the Bulge videos, I can highly suggest you clicking either link. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to catch you in another video. Cheers!